All right, everyone, welcome back to the Synthesis Workshop, or SW podcast. Today, I have the privilege of being joined by Professor Mike McGuirk, who is a assistant professor at the Colorado School of Mines. And I would say for the typical synthesis workshop, who is probably more organic. Today, we're going to dive into supramolecular kind of inorganic chemistry. And I guess full transparency, the reason I'm having Professor McGuirk on today is because he came to the University of Houston a few weeks back and gave a really nice talk within his field. So I definitely wanted to get him on here and talk about it because I would even kind of a quick aside, I would say one of the benefits of being in graduate school is really all the seminars you can go to. That was not really advertised when I was first thought about going to graduate school. I don't know about you, Professor McGuirk. I don't know if during your graduate school, like if you any outstanding seminars you're able to attend kind of coming through, because I think that's one of privileges of it.
I completely agree with you. Summa, I think, is one of the most exciting parts of graduate school. I think when you're doing more or less the same project for 4.5, 5 years, or whatever have you, you can kind of really get into this really myopic bubble. And I think Summa really is an amazing opportunity to see what else is out there. Things you would never have the time or energy to read the literature on. And so when you can get someone, who's representing their field to come in and kind of give you a direct presentation on what's going on in something beyond your scope, the opportunities are fantastic. And, you never know what little, nugget from a different presentation from something way outside your field might really, turn on a light bulb when it comes to whatever you're doing in the lab. And so I'm a huge proponent for seminar, and I think students should go to as many as they possibly can, because it's going to, if you kind of make the comparison with sitting and, kind of going through the literature, you get a lot more information in a much shorter period of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think people just don't have time to keep up with all literature that's out there, even within your own, let's say, project, let alone everything else, right? And I've had one of the added benefits, I would say, University of Houston seminars this year specifically is that I guess the person that's running it is in the PChem division. Last year was the organic division, so this year we've had a little bit more focus on inorganic and PChem, which has been really eye-opening for myself, who comes from an organic background. So yeah, I mean, if you're a graduate student, go to as many seminars as you can. I mean, it's only maybe an hour a week, so it's not even really like that much. And it's super chill. It's not like anything too rigorous. You can really just kind of check into the presentation.
And I would say, and because at UH you don't have. Do you all have rigorous divisions? I can't remember.
We do. We have like organic or inorganic and physical.
Yeah. So I would say that for students who are at larger graduate programs that have really rigorous divisions and the seminars are broken up based on those divisions, I would really suggest going outside of your individual division as well. You're going to see something completely different. That was one thing that I really liked at my graduate school, is that there weren't official divisions anymore. And so your seminars were very, very different week to week. And so you saw a lot of different science, which I think is incredibly beneficial. So yeah, I would really push students to go outside of their division if that's the situation at their institution.
Yeah. And luckily for the most part, because at least for most seminars, they're picked by the faculty. At least that's how it works at UH. Most of the time, I would say 95% of the time you're actually, you're going to get a good presentation, right? Because they're handpicked by the faculty members. So that's in my experience anyway. But yeah, so, without further ado though, we'll hop right into this then. Mm-hmm. So a little bit about your background to get going here. I know you were born in Canada, Toronto, Canada, but then moved to the States in your early 10s, I guess.
Yeah, I was 10 years old, yeah.
So, after Toronto, I mean, kind of coming up through middle school and high school, that would have been after that, did you, any hobbies, activities, any initial interest in STEM? Like how was that all come about?
Yeah, so I would say sports really dominated my youth. So Being a token Canadian, hockey was my life.
Yep.
I played hockey and soccer competitively for basically my entire childhood, and even kind of up through college with club sports. So that was honestly the big thing for me, were sports in high school. But I mean, the STEM passion was always there. And so I was fortunate enough where my mom's a medical doctor. And so that was, that always kind of seemed like the path that I was kind of not being pushed towards, but kind of like the natural path. I feel like when you're a kid, is that you have these kind of narrow views of what's the profession or what you should be. I feel like a lot of kids that if they're doing decently in school, they're like, oh, I'm going to go be a medical doctor. But I feel like we don't have as much of an idea of like what opportunities there are to be scientists or what it means to be a scientist. So, I mean, honestly, I didn't really grasp the idea that being a professional scientist was an actual thing until I was in college. It's just it's not something you hear about as often growing up.
Right. I think I guess another shout out to graduate school. I suppose I didn't know we were going down this route, but yeah, the unique opportunity to do actual science also didn't really occur to me until latter years of undergraduate, when I was like, oh, you can actually just do benchtop or computational science as as a profession, and that's quite it's really interesting to learn really late on. I don't really know. I mean, I suppose let's say drug development's kind of easy to kind of market as when you're coming through middle school, I guess. But I don't know, nothing really a hardcore scientist I would say gets really pushed though. I could be wrong on that though. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, I think I can kind of gather what you're saying. It's just less tangible.
Yeah.
So I have a sister who's a veterinarian. If she went to a middle school and said, I'm a veterinarian, I help, I work with dogs and cats. That's a very tangible thing that, you can wrap your head around. But, if I went to a middle school and I say we develop nanoscale sponges for
that's literally, yeah.
And so it's just less tangible. It's not something that they've ever seen with their own eyes. And so that is kind of the challenge of trying to develop really strong ways of speaking with younger students, and
right,
to get them about able to kind of visualize what you're talking about. And that's why I think especially fields like chemistry and physics, we lean so hard on demonstrations, your classic elephant toothpaste type of stuff. It's not it's not related to any of the research, but it's something that it's visually impactful and
right.
tangible.
It definitely piques his initial interest. I want to go back real quick to something you said about just on the hockey thing real quick, because I'm curious to know if I don't know if you keep up with the NHL. I assume you're a Maple Leafs fan. I just want to, yeah, okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a miserable existence.
Listen, I'm by no means an expert in NHL, but I used to, before I graduated, one of my coworkers, who is a Devils fan, but he keeps up with the NHL, and he would kind of tell me what's going on, and he would I hate to say this, but he would joke about the Maple Leafs because it was for years basically you guys were cursed with not getting be able to get past the first round. I don't know how true that was until this last year.
True, it was very true.
Oh Jesus.
Yeah, I would say that I think the most direct analogy for Americans is that the Maple Leafs are like the Dallas Cowboys. Where they're to the league and to the sport, they're really important and kind of a central point. And people who are fans of those clubs are incredibly passionate, and everyone else hates them. And recently, they haven't really achieved anything, are typically kind of overrated.
Yeah,
so I feel like the Maple Leafs are kind of the Cowboys of hockey. But I'm actually the Leafs are here in Colorado tomorrow, so I'm actually going to the game. So,
oh wow, awesome. How are the Maple Leafs shipping? I know that in the brief thing that I know about NHL though, I know the Avalanche have been good for a while now, so I don't know if the Avalanche are still on top, but
yeah, no, they're still very good, and
yeah.
so the Blues are very good as well this year, and so it should be a really good game. I'm looking forward to it.
Who's kind of a top 4 or 5 favorites to kind of win the Stanley Cup this year? I
I would
don't
say
know.
the Avalanche are definitely in the conversation. And then you have like your Boston Bruins, Florida Panthers are very good. New York Rangers are good. Um,
The Southeast states all of a sudden got really good. The Panthers, the Lightning, and the
yeah,
Hurricanes, right? They just all of a sudden got real good.
yeah. Actually, there's something really interesting about the Hurricanes. So Carolina Hurricanes is that their assistant general manager, so the guy who's basically second in line for all the kind of decisions on the team, a guy
Hmm.
named Eric Tulsky. And Eric Tulsky actually got his was one of Jeff Long's first PhD students at Berkeley.
Wow.
So Eric Tulsky has a PhD in chemistry. I think in the very late '90s he got it, and this story is kind of second, third, fourth hand. But basically, he was working in industry, chemical industry, and got just in the early 2000s is when analytics started to kind of become a niche thing in hockey, and he was just really, really into it, and so he kind of was part of the initial development of analytical models for hockey, and eventually started actually getting hired by teams. And so,
Wow.
for kind of people who are in the know with the league, he's kind of the guy where everyone's like, "This is the smartest man in hockey right here." And so, the only reason he hasn't been hired as a full-blown general manager is because he's not a traditional like hockey guy, as
Yeah.
people say. But I think people expect that in the near future he'll be a general manager in the NHL. And so he went from literal, PhD at Berkeley to kind of doing a hobby to now being in incredibly high up roles. And Carolina, team that he's with, are kind of considered to be one of the best run teams.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a really
Wow.
cool story. Yeah, it's a really cool story.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that is super cool.
And I'm sure I have some of the facts wrong, but
Well, you know what? That sounds like a good story, so we'll
yeah,
stick with that.
yeah,
And
yeah,
the great thing is if the story is wrong, people let us know in the comments. We'll make sure that story is right. But
yep.
for now, I'm gonna believe that story. That's really
Well, he's
cool.
definitely there. Now, he definitely came from the
Yeah,
long,
yeah. But like,
but the middle part,
yeah, sure. How he got picked up, maybe a little bit of fantasy, but he definitely got his PhD. He's definitely a assistant general manager of the Hurricanes. That
yeah,
much is definitely true. That's really cool, though. But that's a good segue then back into the chemistry route, I guess. And so, before we get to Jeff Long and your postdoctoral experience, you definitely want to start maybe your undergrad. Was it because I know you did your undergrad at University of Minnesota?
mm-hmm.
Large school, fantastic chemistry school. I can't really speak on the inorganic division, but I know that the organic division is, again, a metallic chemistry there is really good. So, so was it kind of an easy decision to head to the University of Minnesota, or how did that
Yeah.
opportunity come about?
So for me, the kind of like I said, like I'm very fortunate with my mom being a medical doctor, but I was the first kid in our family to go to university in the U.S. And we didn't have like a real grasp on what that all meant. And so in Canada, you kind of just like go to the school that's in your where you live. For the closest place for me would have been University of Wisconsin,
Mm-hmm.
Madison. But after moving from Toronto to a relatively small town, Appleton, Wisconsin, I really wanted to get back out into a city. And growing up, we played a lot of hockey tournaments in Minneapolis. So I really liked Minneapolis. Wanted to go to a really large school because I was at a very small high school.
Yeah.
And fortunately, Minnesota and Wisconsin have what's called reciprocity, meaning that you can pay in-state tuition at a school in a different state.
Wow, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, so that's huge. Like I wouldn't have gone there if I had to pay out-of-state tuition. But
Right.
people, there's a whole bunch of states that have reciprocity. It's usually next door neighbors, so you could go for the same price as going to Madison. So yeah, I wanted to move back to a big city. I wanted to kind of be at a very large school because I went to a very small high school. And then the other thing is when I went to college, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life.
Fair.
So if you kind of scrutinize my like CV, you see that I have a bachelor's in arts in chemistry, and because I when I got to college, I had no idea what I did wanted to do, so I just went into the liberal arts college because that gave you the most freedom. And by the time I really started to decide on chemistry, I didn't feel like changing my colleges within Minnesota. So yeah, I have a bachelor's in arts. So I have a chemistry degree from the Liberal Arts College of Minnesota instead of like the classic Bachelor of Science.
Yeah.
But actually, I think that when I think back, I'm actually very, very happy that's how it worked out because I did a lot more writing in college because of, I had to do all of the electives as part of my liberal arts degree. So I was doing a lot of writing, which I think in the long term has really benefited me. So
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
Especially when writing papers and stuff like that. It's one thing to kind of do the science, it's another thing to write about it, and that's certainly a skill that needs hours of kind of honing. So definitely hear that. Now, yes, but like you said though, so you were in kind of the liberal arts school, and you eventually decided on chemistry, and you even minored in biochemistry. But how did you initially get into chemistry then? So how did that kind of come about?
I did orgo because I initially took like your classic orgo courses because I was still kind of back in my mind thinking about the pre-med stuff.
Sure.
So I was knocking out those courses. And honestly, orgo didn't really do it for me, which is kind of ironic because that's what I teach now. But the course that really solidified, like, I am going to be a chemist for me was inorganic chemistry. So that was taught by Larry K, QUE, who's actually either just retired or just about to retire. And I cannot say enough good things about Professor K. Phenomenal scientist, phenomenal teacher. He was really the person who set me on the track of being a chemist. His daughter is now a professor at Austin.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, inorganic was really the class where I was like, okay, I'm doing this. I'm staying with this. And then at the same time that I was taking inorganic, I just started working in Bill Tolman's lab. So Tolman taught first semester organic. And like I said, organic wasn't really for me, but I still really wanted to get into a lab. And his lab was really much more inorganic, small molecule inorganic. We were making copper oxo complexes. So that experience being in the lab, the experience taking inorganic chemistry, that's what really crystallized everything for me.
Yeah. I always kind of envy the inorganic undergrad experience because while in my undergrad at Wide University, like I had great like inorganic faculty members, but the problem was when I took organic, it was the first semester of COVID. So I got to be honest, I really didn't learn anything because I was just, a kid in, just goofing around during COVID time. So it was like, I didn't really learn anything seriously. And it's by far my weakest area. I'm trying to catch up on it now, but I didn't really learn anything during that first COVID semester anyways. It's neither here nor there now, but so what's interesting though is that you had an initial interest in inorganic chemistry, and yeah, organic just didn't really do it for you. I definitely find that interesting. Now, how did you kind of stick through the organic part of it? Because it's something that I'm always curious to hear about because people get so, at least I guess people that go through chemistry, because first is like Gen Chem, then you take Orgo. And so to be able to kind of stick through that, let's say, and see through that, unless you were a chemistry major, you wouldn't have the opportunity to do that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about kind of sticking through that and then kind of having the opportunity to take inorganic chemistry.
I mean, for me, honestly, I don't think I'm a model for thinking about, that kind of period of time in your education, because I was very much just motivated, unfortunately, by getting my grades. And I would honestly say I didn't feel like I truly got a grasp on organic chemistry until much later, because I feel like I did approach it the wrong way, where I was like, I'm just going to get in, like try to memorize all this and get the grade. And so it was one of those things where I was just at the time motivated by the grades. And I think that's very, in retrospect, that was unfortunate. And so, but one of the things that I really have learned recently and have thought back about is, why did I love inorganic chemistry so much?
Mm.
And the thing that I've really realized is that it was because it was really much more a visual field to me, because instead of just saying here's reactions and we use arrows to bookkeep, it was taught, at least by Professor K, in really building up from orbitals and thinking about the symmetry of orbitals and the energy of these orbitals and how they're responsible for structure and reactivity. And so that was the thing that it just made so much more sense to me, because to me it was much more rational. We build up to learn the core of what explains everything, and then we do stuff with it. And unfortunately, I still think at most places, undergraduate organic is still kind of stuck in this. Here's a reaction, and we'll push an arrow, and the arrows don't tell you really why anything's happening. They're just showing you what's happening, and it's bookkeeping. And so, I teach undergraduate organic second semester, and I'm trying to kind of slowly manipulate the curriculum.
Mm.
But what I've been able to do is I've actually also, again, kind of ironically, teach advanced organic at the graduate level. And School of Mines, our chemistry department, I mean, we don't have hardcore organic chemists. Partly you can tell the fact that I'm teaching organic chemistry. And so it doesn't make sense to really just like go through reactions. And so that class is very much so like a frontier orbital theory class, or stereoelectronic effects, whatever you'd like to kind of think about it as. And so the reason for that is twofold. One, as I think frontier orbitals can be applied and thought about in any kind of field of chemistry, and it's kind of a ubiquitous thought process. At varying levels of utility, but if we can, instead of saying these electrons go here with an arrow, explain simple reactions like SN2 from the standpoint of the HOMO of a lone pair of electrons on a nucleophile interacting with the LUMO antibonding orbital of like a alkyl halide, then all of a sudden, backside attack really means something, and stereo inversion really means something. And so I think we have the tools in organic chemistry, being stereoelectronic effects and frontier orbital, to think about organic chemistry the same way that inorganic chemists think about structure and reactivity. And I feel like those tools are a much more intuitive, rational way to teach organic chemistry. So that's kind of like there's people definitely already doing that at the undergraduate level, but I feel like I wish that was a more ubiquitous way of being taught. Because I'm not a big fan of how the modern pedagogy of organic chemistry at most places.
Yeah, I definitely agree with much of what you said. What I'm realizing right now as you were talking, Professor Bill Tolman's like the Tolman electronic parameters, right? That Bill Tolman. I'm pretty sure. Like the Tolman electronic parameters. Is that the right one?
Like cone angles and stuff like that. No, that's a different person, I believe.
Is it a different person? Oh man. Okay. Well, I was like, Bill Tolman, and I'm looking at like copper auction addicts now, and I was like, are these the same person? But anyway,
It's Chadwick Tolman.
Yeah. Chadwick Tolman. Okay, sorry about that, viewers. But how did they? What I am curious to know too is how did the opportunity to do like undergraduate research with Bill Tolman and Lincoln Potter though too, because I know that can be kind of a daunting task for an undergrad to kind of go ask, but I'm kind of curious to see how the opportunity arose.
Yeah, I mean, so Professor Potter was who I worked with. I worked a year in kind of a classic pharmacology, biochemistry type lab, because I had a biochemistry minor. So in both cases, I took a class from them and was interested and just asked. Really, just kind of have to be that direct, and that's the same way that I'm going to have about 5 undergraduates in my lab here pretty soon, and in every case, it was literally a student sending me an email, and then just sitting down and chatting with them and seeing if I felt like it was a good fit. So yeah, I mean, with undergrads, I mean, no one's going to come ask you to come work in their lab. you have to take the initiative. If you're going to do that, you need to do your homework first. Don't just go up to a professor and be like, "Can I work in your lab?" But like, "Hey, I saw you work on this. I tried to read some of your papers." As undergraduate, you're probably not going to be able to really interpret them that well. But showing the initiative and showing that you want to work in a lab for a specific reason is really going to be the deal breaker, the maker or the breaker, especially at very large universities. Like places like PUIs, primarily undergraduate institutions.
Yep.
You still have to have the initiative, but the opportunities are more abundant, and that's kind of the nature of the thing. But at an R1 institute like Houston or Mines or Minnesota, it's really about taking the initiative.
Yeah, for sure. Now, so after your undergraduate research, you actually done an intern at Ecolab, but before pursuing your then PhD at Northwestern. Before your PhD, I'm kind of curious to know, because I hear this a lot. It's like after kind of doing well. I mean, you're only intern. Maybe I don't really know the job title of it. Yeah, full gap year. Okay. But returning to, I know sometimes like returning, let's say to graduate school can be difficult. But if it's if you're kind of a gap year, that's fine.
Yeah, my advice on I think gap years are very good for students to take.
Yeah,
they're really healthy.
They can be.
Yeah, but don't take more than 1 year. I feel like that's really you do 1 year, don't do more than that. I think after 1 year, and that you can get too comfortable, let's say, and then going back to graduate school can be hard. But I think a 1 year gap is extremely healthy. Because grad school is inevitably a slog. And I think if you just jump straight from undergrad to grad, it can burn you out.
You definitely can feel the burnout. No, I definitely hear that. I've heard that from a lot of people, particularly if you're doing a postdoc after graduate school. I've heard take that gap year or like just take some time, like prolonged time after graduate school before doing a postdoc. That in particular I've heard can be really leads to a lot of burnout. But yeah, that's what I've heard.
I'm not as familiar with people doing like a significant gap between grad and post, but I would definitely say try to take a couple months.
Yeah, whatever feels right. Take a couple months. But so like I mentioned though, so you did graduate school at Northwestern. How did you? You did your graduate studies with Professor Chad Mirkin at Northwestern. So, how did you choose graduate school? And how was that opportunity at Northwestern?
So for graduate school for me, I really wanted to go somewhere where it seemed like the big picture was there, and thinking about what we're using why are we doing the chemistry. At the time I wasn't as kind of into doing chemistry, just kind of for the fundamental science of it. I think that's something that kind of changed, but at the time, I'm 22 years old. But it what ended up happening is doing chemistry that really was extremely fundamental and not towards any specific goal. That's how it ended up working. And so really one of the main reasons I ended up working with Chad was a guy named Alex Spokojny, who's now a very, very successful professor at UCLA. And actually the department head there now. And Alex was just finishing up in the Mirkin group, and we only overlapped for about 4 months or so. But extremely charismatic, incredibly brilliant scientist, and just interacting with him, that was really what drew me to the group and working on a similar project to what Alex did. And then, working in a group like Chad's, it's a very financially robust group, we can say. So you have all the tools that you could possibly want at your fingertips. And so that was really alluring, is that going in and knowing that I won't have any limitations on the science that I want to do, and I can just go in and focus on it. So that was definitely attractive.
Yeah. Now, anything in particular that drew you to Northwestern though? I mean, I don't know if you applied anywhere
So
else or like,
I really liked that. I like living in and around cities.
fair.
Northwestern, it's just north of Chicago. I really liked that it was near Chicago. I love that town. Living and being in and around Chicago in your 20s is incredible amount of fun.
Yep. I can
And
believe
so that
that.
was really attractive. And then and now the woman who's now my wife was also willing to move there.
There you go. Yep.
Yeah. So we
Big
were
place.
yes, yeah. So
Yeah. No
yeah,
brainer.
actually, very excitingly, I'm going back to Northwestern on this coming Thursday to give a lecture. So that'll be really fun.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah,
Nice alma
yeah.
mater.
So yeah, I really liked the opportunities there in terms of being able to do the science that you want to do. I also liked the living somewhere that I enjoy. Living somewhere that I enjoy is extremely important to me. It's one of the reasons why I'm here now in Colorado.
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, Chicago is a great town to be in your
I def
20s.
I definitely took a non-traditional route when choosing graduate schools. If I'm being completely honest, I chose Houston. I didn't even know who was really in this department because I'm the type of personality who will kind of get along with anyone and kind of goes with the flows. But I picked it because I'd like to live in Houston in my mid-20s. So um, it's definitely a valid question, I think, if you're choosing graduate schools. It's like,
Yeah,
if think about where you want to live.
you're gonna be there for 5 years.
Yeah.
Um, in your 20s. I think I think a lot of times people like to say that they just choose a place for the science, but I'm not afraid to admit that lifestyle is very important to me.
Yeah. I'm definitely not afraid to admit it, and I'm not even saying that people should do what I did, but it worked out for me. But yeah, definitely a heavy consideration to think about where you're going to live.
Mhm.
It's I would say, especially if you're not from the North Midwest, Chicago and Minneapolis can get very, very cold in the winter, like
Yeah,
extraordinary cold. So if you're not used to that,
yeah,
I don't. It's something to deeply consider.
yeah. For me, Chicago is the furthest south I'd ever lived in my life at that point.
Yeah,
So
that's
it
crazy.
was moving from Minneapolis, Chicago is balmy.
That's nothing.
Yeah.
Now, I see during your graduate studies had working on stimuli responsive complexes. So and we'll definitely return to that when we talk about your research. But I can see it's kind of, I guess maybe it's early developments or had gotten you thinking in that type of field. I don't know if you want to just tell us a little bit about what you did, like what you worked on as a graduate student.
Yeah, sure. So, kind of, I think Chad's more famous for working in nanoscience,
Mm.
both therapeutics, but also the assembly of nanoparticles and the synthesis of nanoparticles. But what a lot of people don't know is that Chad is actually a trained inorganic chemist. Came from the small molecule inorganic community, and so he kind of always kept a small kind of subgroup of around, well, small for Chad, where there was 80 people in the group when I was there. About 10 people working on small molecule complexes, primarily using what we are called hemilabile ligands. So these are bidentate ligands where you have disparate coordination strengths between the two coordinating units. And you could basically turn it from having two of the the coordinating elements bound to having one and kind of switching on and off. And what we kind of figured out, amongst other things, is that you could use this to basically control functionality on ancillary functionalizations on the ligand.
Hmm.
And so, really, kind of by happenstance, I started looking at hydrogen bond donating catalysts. And what we kind of, if you kind of look through the literature of those types of catalysts, so urea, thiourea, square mids, is that you'll see that one of the can be the downfalls of especially the earlier generations is that they'll aggregate with themselves because they have hydrogen bond donating and accepting groups on the molecule, so they can self aggregate. And basically, what we figured out is that if we make these hemilabile ligands with a urea or a thiourea or a square mid coming off of it, you could turn the catalytic activity basically on and off by switching the coordination at the metal center
Mm.
and turning the aggregation of the catalysts on and off. And so what you have is, we like to think about it in terms of like an allosteric system, is that you, through the stimulus, adding something that coordinates the metal center, removing that from the metal center and changing the ligand coordination, and changing effectively the rigidity of the whole system, is that you can turn off intermolecular aggregation and then
That's really
turn
cool.
on catalytic activity.
That's really cool. So after your graduate studies, then you moved to UC-Berkeley to do a postdoc with Professor Jeff Long. And like I mentioned, I'm not an inorganic background, but I do know Jeff Long's name shows up a lot in inorganic seminars, and people that the inorganic professors that I know, his name shows up a lot. Now, how did the opportunity arise to go to UC-Berkeley to do a postdoc with him?
Yeah, things just kind of fell in place with that. So one of the professors who was on my committee at Northwestern got his PhD from Jeff. And so after a presentation I gave in my fourth year to my committee, that professor basically set up the postdoc, and I kind of like saw the potential of what I was trying to do, and then when someone offers you a postdoc with Jeff, you don't say no.
That's my impression.
Yeah. And so it was an incredible opportunity. And I just couldn't turn it down.
Right.
And so it was slightly tough. My wife, fiance at the time, it was tough to move away from Chicago. We had really developed an incredible friend base. So it was a tough move, but also, I'm extremely fortunate to have a spouse who was and continues to be supportive. Someone who has her own very fruitful career, but so making a very big move from the Midwest out to California.
Yeah, I would say two things. Well, two things about that actually. So, the idea of becoming a professor at the time, was that kind of going through your mind at this point, or let's say before even you had gotten approached about the postdoc thing?
So I was very much so on the fence at that point. I was kind of going through grad school, just doing my science and just loving doing my science.
Yep.
And so at Northwestern, I think they got rid of it, but we had it was a fourth year research proposal where you had to give like an hour-long presentation on something that had nothing to do with your science.
An hour long? That is crazy.
Yeah, in front of your committee. And then there was like a written part of it too. And so I don't think I'm like the best, like smartest scientist, or very, very, very far from it. And I think there are many people who are much better, like just like kind of classically smarter than me.
Sure.
I think my strength is more in the creativity side. I think that's what I kind of bring to the table. And so that opportunity to do a research proposal on basically whatever you wanted was pretty alluring to me. So I put a lot of work into that. And basically what I proposed is what's turned into our work on chalcogen bonding and halogen bonding materials. And so that proposal, went quite well. And so actually one of my committee members was Fraser Stoddart, who won the Nobel Prize a couple of years later. And so he gave me some really encouraging words after the proposal, and then that compounded with the offer to go work for Jeff. That really I think I can do this.
Yeah.
So that was a huge crystallizing turning point for me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a huge word of encouragement. The other thing I was going to say is something that probably not often talk about, that maybe there should be a conversation about it just in general, but the idea of, having a supportive spouse that will allow you to do these kind of opportunities, because like you mentioned, you more or less had to pursue I don't know if it was really a dream at this point, maybe you can elaborate, but the opportunity to do a postdoc with, a well-respected, well-known professor, but having to move halfway across the country, when you had already established really friends and family in Chicago. I mean, I don't, it's a really tough decision. So,
Oh yeah,
I don't know if
yeah.
you want to just feel free to, we don't have to, but feel free to, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit. Like,
Sure. Yeah.
yeah.
We had definitely kind of talked about of just like settling down in Chicago,
Mhm.
and so when this opportunity came up, my wife now, I think she could really, because she's not a chemist. She works in, she actually now works at the national lab here
Oh, wow.
in the National Renewable Energy Lab, on the communication side. But I think she could, based on talking, seeing the enthusiasm that I had, and also talking directly to some professors at Northwestern who were friends of ours by that time, um, that she could see how unique of an opportunity this was, um, and being the amazing spouse that she is,
Yeah.
realized that this was something that I would really have a hard time passing up.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and at the time, we didn't have kids, or anything like that. But yeah, it was, it wasn't like we were moving to the middle of nowhere. It was, the opportunity exciting to, for effectively two Midwestern kids. She's from Minnesota, to move out to California, for is something that is definitely alluring.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very hard. It was um, to make such a dramatic change when we lived in a place where we could theoretically spend the rest of our lives, and there's lots of opportunities for both of us. But it was a leap of faith,
Yeah.
and I'm forever grateful that she was willing to do that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's important for people to hear sometimes, like taking that leap of faith sometimes. And, if you have a supportive spouse, I mean, you really can make it work, I think. And so even, it can be a difficult choice.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think it's important for people to hear that sometimes. So, but now you're at Berkeley, working with Professor Jeff Long, as a postdoctoral fellow. Uh, I'll let you take the reins a little bit too. I mean, I don't know if you had worked on maybe some of your proposals when you were a graduate student, or if you were working on something else in Professor Jeff Long's lab.
So when I got to Jeff's group, I started working on Miller-Ganning frameworks, and so that was kind of a leap, going from small molecule complexes to basically three-dimensional inorganic complexes. And so I had collaborated on a paper during my PhD with Omar Farha. At the time was a research professor with Joe Hupp, but now is a full professor at Northwestern, running his own extremely successful Miller-Ganning framework-based laboratory. So I had a little bit of exposure, and my proposals I was just talking about at Northwestern were trying to design porous materials. And so the opportunity to work for Jeff and then start to learn from the best in working on Miller-Ganning frameworks was really what I dove into. And one of the things that was kind of like the cohesive line was that I was able to work on frameworks that had also kind of a stimulus response part to them. So stimulus responsiveness with the small molecule complexes was basically my entire PhD. And then with my postdoc, moving into three-dimensional materials, but still looking at systems that would change something about themselves in response to changing pressures of gases. So that to me was the connective tissue there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I definitely, this is actually a good transition then into the research you do now, because this is an extension of really your postdoctoral studies. You broadly, your research is in supramolecular material science, but you're really in kind of different areas. I would say you're kind of tackling a lot of different problems, which is pretty unique and really cool to talk about. So I guess we'll start with the stimulus-responsive frameworks to do frameworks. And so I'll let you take the wheel here a bit, because It's definitely one of my favorite parts of your talk when you came to Houston, but definitely want to let you explain your research.
Yeah. Yeah. So one project that I did with Jeff was looking at these metal organic frameworks that undergo pretty dramatic changes in basically the void space inside the lattice. And they do so by switching between two crystallographically defined states, and the connectivity doesn't change, but basically just through subtle changes to the angles of the coordination and the angles of ligands relative to one another, you basically go from a state that has more or less no porosity in it to one that has significant porosity. You can kind of think about it as having a sponge that's completely wrung out and dry to one that's becomes more open and accessible. And there's kind of two reasons why I started looking at this. One is just extremely interesting. How does a three-dimensional crystal that has three-dimensional connectivity change its structure and without losing connectivity? And why does it do that? Like, why is it thermodynamically allowed for some systems, whereas most metal organic frameworks do not have this kind of long-range flexibility? It's a very small subset of frameworks that'll do this. So why in the world do they do that? That's something that we're trying to understand, because it's not understood really at all. But also leveraging that flexibility and the unique way that gases are absorbed into those materials to kind of achieve more efficient behavior for things like hydrogen storage, but also the separation of small molecules. And so we've really focused on those are kind of the two more applied parts of that work: is how can we separate molecules using these responsive frameworks, and how can we store and deliver things like hydrogen in a more efficient manner using these flexible frameworks.
So a question on the, like, let's say understanding the why. I mean, how are you, I don't know if this is giving too much away. I mean, I have no idea, but how do you go about trying to study those processes? I assume you could do maybe some of it computationally, but
yeah,
I don't know how you guys plan on probing those questions.
Yeah, so we have a really good computational collaborator who we work with, Brian Space at North Carolina State, and his research professor, Catherine Forrest. And so we're working with them, basically using all the crystallographic analysis that we've done in collaboration with others like Craig Brown and Ryan Klein at NIST. And using that as a model system to try to figure out, we have crystallographic characterization of basically the end states, but we're trying to basically model how it gets from one to the other. What's the lowest energy path from one place to another? That's something that we can't really see experimentally. But really, to me, the thing that has held back the field is that if you look at the really known cooperatively flexible frameworks in the field, they're all very, very different from each other. Different structures, different ligands, different metals, different modes of flexibility. And so that's a problem, because if you're trying to basically figure out why a bunch of things share a similar property, but more or less nothing else about them is the same, it's really hard to do a scientific analysis and figure out what is kind of, the underlying variables. And so what we've done a bunch of work on basically trying to systematically derivatize flexible frameworks, some work that we've published, mixed linker multivariate flexible frameworks. And what we think is that offers kind of a toolbox to make a lot of flexible frameworks with slightly different behavior, but many more controlled variables, more similar structures, metal centers, all these things. But we're more systematically tuning the variables and seeing how that changes the property. And that allows us to start doing a more like rigorous scientific investigation of where the flexibility is coming from.
Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely curious to see where that leads to. Another area, and this is kind of something that you had mentioned a bit earlier, but so the applications of, let's say, these frameworks. One is, like you mentioned, hydrogen storage. And if I remember correctly from your talk, you were able also to separate like propene from propane. Is that correct?
Propylene from propane, yeah.
Propylene from propane, that's right. So, why? Well, an obvious question is why is it? Well, we hear a lot of talk about hydrogen fuel cells and as let's say a clean energy source, but it's very difficult to do. But I'll let you explain why that's much more difficult and how your research area is kind of able to tackle that. Um, but also separating propylene from propane, I definitely would love to hear again because it was really cool, I thought.
Yeah.
So,
So yeah, in the hydrogen realm, if we think about kind of a hydrogen energy economy, you need to make the hydrogen, you need to move the hydrogen, and then you need to use it. And there's a lot of incredible scientists working on making hydrogen from renewable energy sources, and also turning the hydrogen back into energy efficiently. But there's kind of this mushy middle of storing, transporting, and delivering the hydrogen that it's just an inefficiency because hydrogen is a gas at normal conditions. That you have to really pressurize it immensely or cool it down immensely to have it have any sort of volumetric density of energy to be reasonable to move. And so the problem with that is that pressurizing and cooling requires a lot of energy, and that drives up cost and energy consumption. And so basically, the way that we think about these porous framework materials is they're like a sponge for the hydrogen. It can densify the hydrogen under much more mild conditions. And then when you have the flexibility element on top of that, you can kind of switch the storage to delivery mode much more efficiently and have basically less energy input. So it's kind of like a trigger to go from storing to delivering and being able to deliver the gas at higher pressures. And then for separations, separating molecules with flexible systems is a really intriguing field right now because there's kind of a lot of conflicting thoughts. A lot of people will say that if a system flexes and changes its porosity, is that once it kind of opens, anything can get in there and you won't get an efficient separation. But what we saw in the work that we published this last year is that the flexible framework we're working with, so when it opens, it doesn't just kind of hop between binary states. There's the closed state, but the open accessible state isn't predetermined. It's dependent on what is inside the pores. And so it adapts its structure specifically to interact with the molecule as strongly as possible. And so it's kind of it's more of a customizable or spontaneously customizable pore as opposed to just snapping between open and closed states. And so when you have a self-optimizing structure to achieve high energy or highly favorable adsorption, all of a sudden you have selectivity because the structure wants to interact with this one molecule as strong as possible and not the other molecule, which it can't interact with as strongly. So we saw that as kind of like the underlying principle. And really uniquely, this material also more strongly absorbs propane instead of propylene. And the vast majority of materials will more strongly interact with an olefin than a paraffin. And so you have what's called inverted selectivity, where you can capture all the alkane. And that's really desirable because you're trying to purify the olefin, like propylene, to use for polymerization.
yeah.
And so, yeah, that was a really exciting journey.
This is extremely excited field, I think. Now, just by extension, then, I mean, maybe this is perhaps because it's super saturated. I'm not really sure, but and maybe you guys are already doing a lot. But I'm curious, like, I mean, are there other gases that you're interested in trying to capture, or other, let's say, let's say chemical streams you guys are interested in, let's say, purifying, or I mean, you guys have a lot of work cut out for you guys already. I don't know if doing more is the route, but I'm kind of curious.
For separations, what our funding now from the Department of Energy is not focused on a specific separation, but it's focused on understanding why some flexible frameworks can do separation successfully and why others can't.
I see.
So we're trying to get at to more the fundamental part of the correlation between adaptive structures and effective separations. Again, because although flexible frameworks have been known for quite some time now, I would really argue that the fundamental understanding of how they behave and how that behavior correlates to observed function is not well understood. And so I think we're trying to really get away from very application driven and drill down to the fundamental science of it,
Yeah.
because it is kind of a black box.
That is really good to hear, because oftentimes, when you hear like I feel like, at least many conversations that I've had, you know, I don't know if organizations like the Department of Energy are really interested in the applications of it. So it's really refreshing to hear that it's almost like return to form, where it's like, no, we need to understand the fundamentals of this first. That's really refreshing.
It really depends on which branch of the DOE
That's
you're
true.
working with. Yeah.
Yep.
And so
Very
our
true.
funding comes from basic energy sciences, which is more or less the very fundamental arm of the DOE. And their mission is fundamental science.
Yeah. That's really good to hear.
Yeah.
And so, so more areas of your research. You guys do also. I don't think you touched on this when you came to Houston, but the chemical recycling of polyolefins. So, I love to hear how you're able to do that. Basically,
well, it's what we hope to be able to do. So I didn't talk about it, but we're actually going to start publishing our first work in the area this year.
Okay.
Awesome. So basically what we're trying to do is develop chemical means to break down polyolefins specifically, in a long-term goal of being able to help mitigate the plastic waste crisis.
Sure.
Basically, the motivator there, beyond the obvious, is that mechanical recycling, our classic recycling methods for things like aluminum and glass, don't work that well, or really work poorly, honestly, for things like plastics, polyolefins. And so the kind of alternative, more recent proposal is using some chemical means to break those underlying polymers down into ideally the monomers that you can then repolymerize, virgin plastics, in what's called a closed loop or circular economy. But of course, breaking down huge chains of saturated hydrocarbons selectively is incredibly challenging, and to put it mildly. And so, in doing so, at any sort of conditions that are not rigorously expensive. And so, you can crack hydrocarbons at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of degrees, but that's not a energetically desirable situation. And so basically what we're trying to do is develop a heterogeneous catalyst in order to do that under much more mild conditions.
Well,
and it's been a bit of a journey, because the system that we've been studying has been out there in the literature for many years, but very poorly understood. And very top-down work where people just throw it at stuff. And it turns out people have been making it very poorly, not characterizing their systems. And so I think, being the chemists that we are, we couldn't just move on without trying to figure out the catalyst itself. And so we've really focused on trying to characterize and nail down the synthesis and purity of the heterogeneous catalyst, because we do know from our own experiments that it can break down polyolefins at around 200 degrees, which is really exciting. But we really want to characterize the system as well.
Yeah, I'm excited to see those results then when it comes out later this year. I will say, for, let's say, chemical recycling of polyolefins, just for the general viewer, it is the reason why it's such a big problem, or let's say it's an untackled problem, let's say, is because, well, polyolefins are just so cheap to make. They're so cheap. And so you have this surplus of polyolefins, and that are used, millions of applications for polymers. But then the cost to depolymerize it is it's so expensive that it's not even worth it. There's no capital gain to really depolymerize it. So it's
a similar argument to something like, let's say, carbon capture. And so it's one of those things where, as scientists and engineers, we need to be thinking years and years out, develop the underlying science, develop the underlying processes, so that when society kind of catches up and there's financial motivations, or either governmental or what have you, then this stuff is ready. And that's what's been happening with carbon captures. Carbon capture, most fundamentally, is based on, it's been possible chemically for decades and decades and decades. And it's really been focusing on trying to make that fundamental chemistry as efficient as possible, depending on the materials, the supports, the processes, all of that. where now we've gotten to a point with carbon capture where you have the government motivations, tax incentives, but also the technology is there. So now we're in a period right now where carbon capture is becoming increasingly deployed.
Yeah, that's exciting to hear then.
And so you can draw a similar metaphor then, or draw the analogy, I mean, to chemical recycling is that, it's starting to build, but we need to get the science ready to when the moment is where everything kind of coalesces societally, financially, is that the technology is there and ready to go.
Mm-hmm. And a couple of other areas of your research is so non-covalently linked porous materials. So this is another part of your research that you discussed when you were at Houston, and it really caught my attention because it's super unique. And so the idea of, well, I think he was like using sigma holes basically, and using kind of metalloids to do the frameworks. I'll let you kind of take the reins on this, but it's super really interesting, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is basically the idea is using what are called sigma hole bonds. So sigma hole bonds are basically a main group analogy to or analogous to hydrogen bonding, where instead of having a hydrogen as your donor atom to form a non-covalent interaction, you're using a late main group element. So things like selenium, tellurium, iodine, where those elements actually have similar electronegativity values to hydrogen. So in the kind of the same way is that if they have a covalent bond to an electron withdrawing group, is that they're going to form regions of positive potential on that atom and can form interactions. Non-covalent interactions, or depending on the system, increasingly contributions of covalency. But there's a lot of tunability. Bonding's a spectrum. The same way, comparing hydrogen bonding to deprotonation. It's just the degree of electrostatics versus orbital mixing. But basically, these sigma hole bonds and their subcategories of halogen bonding, nictogen bonding, chalcogen bonding, even tetral bonding, have really increasingly been recognized, with halogen bonding and chalcogen bonding being defined by IUPAC in the last couple of years. And there's a ton of work going into crystal engineering with these non-covalent interactions, and we've been trying to kind of push that to what we think as the next level is functional materials, where the connective tissue are these non-covalent sigma hole bonding interactions. And so we've been focusing on halogen bonding and chalcogen bonding. So far, our greatest successes have been with chalcogen bonding, where we've been able to actually, for the first time, show that you can assemble not only porous materials through only chalcogen bonding interactions, but in some unpublished work that we have coming up, permanently porous systems, where you have a system that, like a metal organic framework or a covalent organic framework, the porosity of the system is stable even in vacuum. So you can actually stabilize empty space in a material where the only connective tissue are these chalcogen bonding interactions. And so that was extremely exciting, because that was basically what that proposal at Northwestern was to do this. And so to actually see it come to fruition has been incredibly exciting.
Mm-hmm. Just on that then, just on the synthetic routes of it, like, I don't know if you want to, I don't know if you can speak on maybe using tellurium at all. Like, I literally know nothing about that element. I don't know, like I don't know.
And so if you kind of look at the journey we've been on in terms of the publications, is that our first work is purely selenium.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's with a selenium as our donor is because we had no idea what we were doing when it came to tellurium. And selenium is much easier to work with than tellurium because it's less redox active. Tellurium is more prone to switching between states. And so we started with selenium and had some success there, and basically made kind of these mixed selenium tellurium systems, and that taught us how to do the chemistry. So it's just, if you do your chemistry of like a classic air-free conditions, we have our glove box, we have our Schlinklein techniques, it becomes very manageable.
Okay.
But tellurium being, kind of being in that metalloid space, it is fairly redox active, and so you have to treat it a little bit more rigorously. Whereas
Yeah.
selenium is a little bit more just like plug and chug.
How I mean, is it easily oxidized? Like, I don't know, like common oxidation states, or is it like extremely sensitive,
Yeah,
like what elements?
you can basically get from 4 to, you can do 4, 2, or 0 pretty easily.
Okay, all right. So okay, well, I'm honestly I'm pretty excited to see the SI of this and see how you like deal with the tellurium. And is it, can you even buy tellurium? Like, is it tellurium salts you have to buy? Like, I don't even really know. Like,
I think our current synthesis is all done with tellurium tetrachloride.
okay, all right. Well, I look forward to that then. Just the SI of that. I'm gonna curious to see how you guys do that. But the last area of research that you're in, and was kind of unbeknownst to me, is kind of unnatural DNA base pairs. I don't know if that's
So it's a project that has kind of been going on in the background, and we're just kind of tinkering right now. But basically, what we're trying to do is see if we can make base pairs in an abiotic system, just in the lab, through, again, these sigma hole bonding interactions. So ATGC are all hydrogen bonding interactions. They have incredibly high fidelities. But the idea is, can you basically make a coplanar XY system where the connective tissue or the connectivity is a sigma hole bonding interaction rather than a hydrogen bonding interaction. And there's innumerable applications for basically expanded base pairs in DNA. One of them is data storage. So there's an increasing push towards using sequence-defined polymers, which DNA is the preeminent sequence-defined polymer, is basically a physical data storage device. But if you think about it, that's what DNA is. DNA is our biological data storage device. And so it's been shown that you can read and write information abiotically with DNA based on the sequence. And under the right conditions, DNA is incredibly stable. And so you could think about you doing archival data storage for centuries with DNA. And then when you need that information, you just go snag your little tube and then you read it. And so, because classic magnetic data storage does not last for a century.
That is crazy.
But molecules are molecules, and so that's the idea, is that we could use a sequence-defined polymer like DNA to do archival data storage. Actually, beyond that, so Eric Anslin down at Texas, the organic chemist, he's one of the co-authors on the modern phys-org book that everyone uses.
Yep, Anslin Dottie. Yep.
So he just gave a talk here last week, and he was talking about some work where they do these sequence-defined, I believe, polyurethanes, and they've been able to do the same thing where you can read and write data with a sequence-defined polyurethane that will degrade when you give it a cue.
That is really interesting. To me, that's an extremely novel idea. I mean, I don't know.
His work's incredible.
I'll have to check on that then, because that sounds super unique. I'll have to follow up with that then. But in any case, Professor McGuirk, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. It was extremely grateful to talk with you and hear about your research. If you are an undergraduate taking interest in inorganic chemistry and thinking about graduate school, man, take a look at the Colorado School of Mines. Look no further, because a lot of your research is kind of return to form fundamental inorganic chemistry, really understanding what's happening at the molecular level. It's always great to see.
We work on materials, but we're 100% chemists, and we're 100% thinking from the atom and building up. And I think that's really that's definitely what I learned from Jeff in working on materials, but recognizing the materials are just chemistry repeated in space,
right?
And treating it like that. And so that's kind of our core philosophy, is whatever we do, we're always chemists first, and we always treat things like chemicals first that require characterization and certain thought process.
Yeah. Well, in any case, Professor McGuirk, thank you again. And
Thank you.
Thank you again for listeners for joining in. And, we'll see you in the next episode.